A doctor, a brother, a crippled patient, a student that would learn to become the Sorcerer Supreme. Doctor Strange is considered to be one of the most mystical aspects of the Marvel Universe. However, he had to go from humble beginnings to a doctor with an ego, to be broken down and struck by tragedy in order to get to where he needs to be. But one has to wonder, which of these two doctors tells the better story? Which of these two actually respects the source material? And which of these two doctors actually stays true to not just the canon characters, but also the lessons that the character actually represents, not just in origin, but also in terms of how to apply some of those lessons into one's own daily life, philosophically as well as realistically. Only one of these doctors actually does what it sets out to do. The other is more on spectacle and visuals while pretending to actually respect the source material because it is taking from one film and applying it to theirs, which is in a sense close to plagiarism in and of itself. What is going on, guys? This is Skyhound, also known as Geek Detective Pierce, and today I am going to be delving into the mystical realm of Doctor Strange. Or in this case, I am going to be comparing a tale of two doctors. The origin of Doctor Strange was obviously long before my time and before technology became what it is now. However, in terms of how the character actually came to be, according to fandoms, it actually started back in the 1960s. In particular, the fandoms seem to cite issue number 110 of Strange Tales. And Doctor Strange actually doesn't appear, except he's only in one particular chapter of this issue. So what particular films am I going to be comparing, since I did mention this is a tale of two doctors? Well, if the clips haven't been clear enough, I'm going over the 2007 animated film of the same title and comparing that with the live-action MCU versions. And here's what I'm going to be comparing and covering the most. According to these notes that I'm making, the first part has to deal with not just the origin story, but how it's executed. Specifically, the intro itself. So what do we get at the start of the 2007 animated film? Well, there are a few unfortunate human victims as a result of a demonic entity that is lurking in the sewers. And we also have the introduction of Mordo and Wong, as well as a few other sorcerers who stumble across the scene and eventually give chase to this demonic entity. What they don't realize is that despite their best efforts, someone actually sees the entire thing unfold. So the person that actually saw the whole mystical chase unfold was none other than Dr. Stephen Strange, a neurosurgeon. Now, before the start of the opening credits of the 2007 animated film begin, one of the sorcerers looks at Wong and asks him, "He saw right through your spell?" And while I'm paraphrasing here, Wong simply just tells him, "It would appear so." Now, before I go on any further, I do want to point out that this is strictly for fair use. I am comparing two films across two different years when they were released. This is simply just my own observation and opinion based on what I understand. And despite not reading these comics, I know that one of them is actually, to an extent, plagiarizing off of another film. Now, with that being said, I'm not going to be adding much of the 2016 film in terms of clips because most have probably just watched that one more times than I can count and likely do not know about the 2007 take. So, with that being said, I'm just going to be going off of memory here in terms of what happens in the 2016 film. At the start, we see Caecilius and his zealots actually enter the library and literally um, take off the head of the head librarian. Yeah, I know, the pun doesn't actually stick, but bear with me here. So he takes out a couple pages from a particular book. It is regarding a ritual. And he gets confronted by the Ancient One, played by Tilda Swinton, and I'll get more into the criticisms of this take a little later on. But she basically points out to Caecilius that that ritual will only bring you sorrow. And instead of confronting her inside the library, he's like, "Yeah, I'm going to take another route." So they take the exit out of the London Sanctum, and despite the onlookers of Londoners actually seeing strange people exiting some sort of a building that seems normal to them on the outside, they get blocked in the mirror dimension by the Ancient One. And Caecilius, knowing what skills she's using, or spells in this case, faces her and calls her outright a hypocrite because she's not following her so called rules. And a fight ensues. Now, Caecilius loses most of his zealots, save for maybe three or four of them, but he doesn't seem to care, as all he needs to do is to find a means of getting out and then continuing on with his plans. Now, he does escape, and the Ancient One realizes that, okay, need to switch gears and find someone else that can assist me in the matter. Now, which of these two actually does set up an exposition better? Well, if we look at the two, we know, or at least fans will understand, that Dormammu is actually a threat. However, in terms of the way Caecilius was done, those who read the comics can make an argument that this live action was not very accurate. Now, why is that? Well, according to the fandom, and I will be frank here, sometimes the people that put information on these fan wikis are also wrong. I will say take this with a grain of salt. Now, in terms of which one actually does it better, here's why the 2007 animated film does what the live action does not. It gets straight to the point. It lists out the characters that are in play, and it also does a foreshadowing in terms of who the actual antagonist is. Let me be clear, Dormammu in this case is still the villain, but he has pawns. And as a certain Marvel mutant once said, in chess, the pawns go first. So, Mordo, Wong, and then you have a few other sorcerers trying to take down a demonic entity that is wreaking havoc across New York City, and they know that creature's objective. While the live action only points out that you have a former sorcerer that doesn't want to adhere to the rules of the basically the ancient one and what she is trying to teach. Now, I will admit that according to fans, Caecilius is better done in the comics, and the film doesn't do what it is supposed to do in this case in terms of knowing who the character is, what the abilities are, and so on and so forth. Whereas Mordo, they really screwed it up on the live action, and I'll get to that part later. But in this case, the edge goes to the 2007 film in terms of opening, setup, and what the main objective is, and as to how Doctor Strange fits into the whole equation, or at least will be. A child being able to see what science cannot explain. And this is not affecting just one child, but multiple. Reckless driving while looking at your phone and not paying attention to the road? Yeah, as if that actually would have more of an impact versus seeing something that can likely haunt your dreams, make your nightmares almost unbearable, and having to be dealing with forces that are beyond science. So, what exactly am I getting at here with this comparison? Well, if you've noticed, there is some parts from the 2007 film that are taken straight into the 2016 take. The only difference is that when it comes to the desperation of Dr. Stephen Strange, that's where the whole comparisons sort of blur. But there are moments from the 2007 film which I will cite a little bit more compared to the 2016 take. Because in the 2016 one, it's like, yeah, they put in some bits, but where was the source from? That is the point. Again, 2007 animated film does what the 2016 film does not, and I'll get to that in a bit. So now that we've seen some of the comparisons here between 2007 and 2016, which one actually holds the edge in terms of telling the events of what led to the accident, at least in terms of how the story is supposed to play out? Well, what do we know? One, the accident makes the damage permanent. Number two, Stephen does go into a bit of mania because he's spending more than his actual means. And it eventually leads to him learning about this place called Kamartash. In this case, again, the edge goes towards the 2007 animated film. Because if you've noticed, as I stated earlier, you have a kid that actually gets haunted by a demonic presence, and it's basically affecting not just her, but multiple kids that have a sort of comatose like state. Versus a doctor with an ego, which is understandable, and basically not paying attention to the rules of the road. With that being said, this is why the 2007 animated film has the edge in terms of explaining the events that leads towards the tragic accident and the loss of hands. So, as it stands, at the moment, it is now 2-0 in favor of the 2007 animated film regarding this titular character. Okay, guys. So before I go into the section regarding the Ancient One, I want to point out a specific moment in which this relates to almost a lot of people. When people complain about inconvenience and then the fact that most people take life for granted, the simple stuff from like either walking or even movement, like I'm doing right now. I recall someone mentioning once that what about those that actually have disabilities, like physical disabilities, and then you have those that have those 1% chance of getting these rare, debilitating diseases that most in the medical field either don't know about or there is very limited knowledge on this particular condition. I want to give some real life examples, at least one in particular. For those of you guys who are fans of the singer Celine Dion, you likely have heard that she has a rare debilitating disease that has limited her movement. Again, how many of us keep complaining about, oh, my shoulder hurts or my back hurts, and don't realize that there are those who have it loads worse than even myself. Now, to get back to the case regarding Doctor Strange, since he no longer has use of his hands, he basically has to try to learn again in terms of, trying to get stuff done. However, He does get a little bit manic, like he goes a little crazy in trying to go back to how times were. And those that are closest to him, at least before he goes to Kamartaj, point out that there is no way you can reverse time, pun intended. And the thing is, between 2006 and then, I mean, 2016 and then the 2007 animated film, is that one of these two films does illustrate this point that I'm trying to make a lot better. So, as we can see here, Strange, being the stubborn guy that he is, doesn't realize that one, when he's trying to, you know, do tasks like, shaving his beard and all of that, and he's unable to, he loses his nerve, gets in touch with his former supervisor, and they have a bit of an exchange about certain procedures. And what this film does bring up that the 2016 one does as well is that Steven is basically saying, all I need is a chance. So, as I mentioned, the live action film does take elements from this and try to spin it and incorporate it in their own way. But here's some other differences. When Kamartaj does get brought up, or at least this place in India, there's a point in the 2016 film where, as Steven is struggling to, like get his hands going again because he's doing physical therapy, and I'm using my hand here as a bit of like an as a example. The physical therapy, I mean, it doesn't seem to like go well for him because he's being impatient, being irrational, and he thinks that, you know, he's desperate trying to get back to his old life. And those, like I said earlier, those around him are saying it's not possible. Well, this physical therapist is pointing out to him there is one case where a guy that had really bad spine injury was somehow able to be walking again. And Steven's looking at him and he's like, that's impossible. Medically, there's no way. And he's like, I want to see the file. And the physical therapist goes, is like, as long as this proves your arrogant ass wrong, it's worth it. So he gets into a bit of a argument with the nurse Christine. And the exchange between these two is almost kind of like, I don't know if I would say literal foreshadowing, but the way it came out when I was watching it the first time was like these two like know each other pretty well. And basically Christina's like, you know, I'm not even gonna bother with you being an egotistical, arrogant, you know, doctor who I used to, work with. And I'm not even gonna bother just trying to help you out. You need to do this on your own, is roughly what she's telling him. And we find out that the file the physical therapist had mentioned about regarding this one patient, Stephen eventually learns about the guy, finds him over at a basketball court, And then that's where he learns about Kamartaj. Now, in the 2007 film, again, they take parts of what I just showed a tiny bit of, and where Stephen using is spending more than his actual means, trying desperately to get his hands fixed, and they all give the same conclusion. The 2016 one does it very briefly, not to the extent that this 2007 animated film did, but they address it nonetheless. So, there's a moment in the 2007 animated film that addresses something that's left out in the 2016 film. Now, whether or not that's actually in the deleted scenes, I'm not entirely sure. Despite having a digital copy, and I know I have a physical copy somewhere, I'll have to look around. But Stephen Strange is at his lowest of low points, despite his numerous attempts at trying to get his hands fixed. And the medical doctors are saying it's past that point. There's no way we can fix it no matter what you try to do. And who comes up to save him but the very person that noticed that he was watching in the first place? I'm talking about Wong. Now, he wasn't actually introduced in the 2016 one until a little bit later at a certain point, because there's something that they did, that the 2016 film practically it goes off in terms of twisting the background regarding Mordo. And I'll eventually get to that guy in a bit. But getting back to the main point here, Wong in the 2007 animated film tells Stephen Strange about Kamartaj, and that he's basically telling him, if you're willing to take this journey, you might find what you were looking for in the first place. The 2016 take, however, this patient that the physical therapist was telling Strange about after he showed him the file, the way the patient describes it is brief, but at the same time, it also sounds vague. So, with that being said, the events that led to the crash, the aftermath, between these ones, which one actually, from my observation, did it better? Now, most are probably going to say that I'm being a little bit unfair because I keep bringing up the 2007 animated film when some probably have not watched it. Well, depending on where you look, you can actually watch the whole thing. You just have to poke around. So, which one has the edge? 2007 or 2016? Well, from my observations, and if you've been paying attention, the edge in this case goes to the 2007 animated film. Now, I will eventually discuss about some things that the 2016 film does good at, but not as well as the 2007 animated film. Notice I'm using the words good and well in particular cases. Feel free to disagree, but if you haven't watched it, you can't make much of an argument. Okay, So while Stephen does make the journey over to Kamartaj, or at least over to Tibet in this case, because in the MCU version he goes over to Kamartaj. But anyway, he does make it over there with the help of Gina. And while some would actually mention that, you know, there is a supposed comparison to how this might bring up the DC universe in terms of Batman Begins, they're two totally different universes. So to make that kind of connection is not only silly, but it shows ones that have an overactive brain and just don't know when to shut it down and just watch and observe. But anyway, Stephen does make the journey, and Wong is there to greet him at the door, and he points out, as one journey ends, another one begins. And when Stephen does meet the Ancient One, I will point out a small parallel here. It's not who he expects. That's one thing that both films have in common. But in terms of what actually occurs when he does meet him between these two comparisons of films, well, it's practically night and day. Now, some of you looking at this clip might probably go, isn't this somewhat parallel to how it was with Batman Begins? While that is regarding DC, that is a totally separate story for another time. On top of that, you didn't have Bruce Wayne and his hands get destroyed through an accident. So that obviously goes out the window. But anyway, Steven does make the journey, and as Wong points out when he's there to greet him at the door, as one journey ends, so another begins. Okay, so now we get to the section regarding the Ancient One. And before I go any further, I am going to point out here that I have no issues with the actress. I have always had issues with the writers and anyone else involved in doing the film. Why is that? Post Endgame is when things start to go bad, but even before the Endgame, it started to slowly go bad. because they keep pushing the whole girl boss nonsense, which is evident post Endgame and even pre Infinity War. You have people who have never read comics, who are not alive during the time when these came out. They weren't even alive during the 90s. Or if they were, they don't know jack shit about it. They never read the comics again. They don't know these characters. They have never learned anything in school, particularly regarding character development and the like, what it is to have hardship, because none of these idiots have never experienced it. None. Now, when it comes to trying to respect the material, the MCU does the exact opposite. So much so that they over obsess with visuals, because that's the only thing that was going on for it. Number two, the 2007 animated film does what the live action does not. On top of that, when we get to the lessons being taught, the MCU does a lame take on it. However, that's not the only thing that the MCU film does wrong. It does a terrible take on the physical issues that Stephen Strange has. Because that's the only thing that they have going for it. The 2007 one goes past the physical. Now, despite the MCU version going on about having to open up one's mind, as the Ancient One points out, what both films address well: Stephen Strange's ego, his arrogance, and his ignorance. Those three things are what both films do well, but I will make a separate point for that. Now, in terms of what was being taught, again, the MCU film does a lame take on it. They try to have Steven conjure a portal. That's all he's doing. The 2007 film addresses his emotional damage, his mental damage, and how both of these contribute to his stubbornness, his cold heartedness, and his arrogance. And that creates a wall, not just mentally, but also emotionally. Combining that into a physical wall that Stephen needs to tear down. Mind you, this is metaphorical. This is the lesson that the MCU film never addresses. Never. On top of that, when I get further into it, there is a huge missed opportunity that fans recognize. He has a sister. Stephen Strange, the reason why he became a doctor and all of that, while they have an odd way of addressing it in the MCU. And I will go over a little more, or at least a little bit, regarding the stupid sequel towards the end. They missed an opportunity. And people likely already know what it is because I'm about to bring it up in the 2007 take. Now, with that being said, which of these two actually addresses lessens and respects the source material more. The edge, obviously, I'm going to say it, goes to the 2007 animated film. I already stated the reasons why. It has issues. I mean, it doesn't have as much issues compared to the MCU. The MCU has issues with writing, it has issues with direction, it has issues with respecting the material. It's all just visuals. And visuals do not always tell the story. That's something that the film obviously can't grasp. So, you can tell right now that the animated film is able to do what the MCU film cannot. So, what's my beef with it? Well, if you're paying attention to what I already listed out, you have people who have not read anything at all. And I've only read a few comics, and yet the way they try to address things from comic to live action, there's definitely dialogue that is important to certain characters. And yet, when you give it to somebody else that it doesn't relate to, and you have a stupid narcissist agenda, well, you just proved that you're not educated. You're just a pawn in the Marxist company that just sees you as nothing more than a useful idiot. You are just a useful idiot, a pawn, again, to these demonic corporations.
In chess, the pawns go first.
Okay, now that I got those little rants out of the way, it's time to get to the main point of this 2007 film that addresses a key point that the MCU never will. Now, for those of you guys who were paying attention earlier in terms of my little comparison on the Ancient One, I'm going to be using mostly pictures and then narrating over this whole thing. So, bear with me for a little bit because not only am I going to be narrating, but when I get to the key point, while I'm just going to be using pictures, I'm going to also be putting in the text, the key exchange between Doctor Strange and the Ancient One. So bear with me for a bit. So there comes a point where Stephen Strange is doing the same routine over and over again, tearing down the wall that he has built up. But he doesn't realize that the whole wall is a metaphor, as I stated earlier. And he's so frustrated to the point where he's about to give up. And he's basically telling Wong, my hands keep getting worse. Nothing is happening. I don't even know what I'm doing here. And Wong is basically pointing out to him, this was never about your hands. You came here trying to seek for something that you don't understand. And yet, the Ancient One was kind enough to let you learn from us to try and work around your problem, which you apparently can't see. And Steven is pretty much annoyed at this point. He's like, then there's no reason for me being here. There is none. So it's gotten to a point that after Steven leaves, Wong is looking at the Ancient One, simply telling him he's not ready. He won't be able to survive out in the cold. And the Ancient One gives Wong a look, just letting him know, yes, what you said is true, but that is his choice. And basically, once Steven leaves, it gets to a point where he's thinking back to when his sister was about to be operated on by him and the team because he already has his doctorate and all of that. However, things don't go to plan. That is how life is. And that's something that Steven is unable to grasp. So now we get to the important lesson that the 2007 film has, which gives it more weight compared to what the MCU film is unable to do. And it is at this point where Steven is at his lowest of lowest points. And here we see the Ancient One mentally materialize in Steven's psyche. And the Ancient One pretty much understands what Steven is going through. So here I am mostly going to be doing audio and then a little bit of impromptu voiceover with not just the quotes, but also to give you guys a general idea as to what's going on. Love, loss, pain. These are the stones in the wall that block your path, Stephen. What? Are you really here? See the wall. So, like I said, I'm just only using bits and pieces and then tear it down. Dialogue here. For the but at this point, I figured I might as well just go over the whole thing from memory. What truth? The Ancient One tells Stephen the truth about what went on and why he became a doctor and all that. Yes, it was to save his sister, but his sister couldn't be saved. And Stephen lashes out at him saying, "How can you say that? She died on my table. She trusted me." And the Ancient One understands how frustrated Stephen is. And he points out to him, "You are a natural healer, Stephen. But not all lives are destined to be saved. It was out of your hands." And he points out and just goes back and looks at the Ancient One, telling him, "I don't believe that." And it is because of that guilt that Stephen has over the death of his sister, because she was the reason why he wanted to become a neurosurgeon in the first place. But she was patient zero. It is because of that despite all Stephen has done in terms of being a neurosurgeon and all of that he can't get over his loss and the pain from that loss. And the Ancient One just outright tells him, and that is what has chained you to this place. That mental prison that he has when he lost his sister. And the Ancient One basically tells him, this guilt and the grief that you are carrying with you, that is what has chained you to this tragedy. You cannot move on. and he's telling him that that those stones that I voiced earlier, love, loss, pain, those three things, those are the emotional and spiritual stones in that mental wall that Stephen had built up that he is struggling to tear down. And the Ancient One, again, he pointed out to him, that is what has chained you to this place. Accept the truth and break free. And I love what he says after that. You stand at the foot of the wall. What is your next move? This is the Ancient One basically telling him, you can continue to wallow in your misery and, go nowhere, or you can come back, work at your problem, and then learn the truth and go beyond your physical problems. This is the lesson that was being taught with the animated film. This is something that the 2016 MCU film failed to address. And it could have been a lot better had they not squandered that important key piece and just made it into a shit show that is the multiverse of madness. A seriously missed opportunity. But that is basically the important lesson that the Ancient One is pointing out to Stephen. Now, again, with that part being said, you can see why the 2007 film has the edge on that lesson that the 2016 film doesn't. I already stated that these pawns do not know what they're doing. And it is because of that. So when Steven comes back, Wong is surprised and he's like, he came back. And he's looking at the Ancient One, surprised, like, you helped him? And then you can see a slight grin on the Ancient One. He's like, just a little. And with that motivation, Steven does go back to that training and he's trying to um tear down the wall, as the Ancient One points out. In the meantime, we have Mordo and the others try to um, deal with another threat from Dormammu. This time he sends some sort of like a pack of hounds. I think they were shadow hounds, as I recall, later on. But Steven is trying to work on tearing down this wall. And the Ancient One is observing his progress. And he's asking him, as Steven is on the ground because he's having trouble pulling at, one brick at a time, if you will. And he's saying to the Ancient One, I'm not giving up. I'm not giving up. I'm just resting. And he's trying to downplay it. And it is at this point where the Ancient One decides to help him out. And he's like, yeah, except I think physics and gravity have something else to say about that. But the Ancient One insists, try and, you know, pull and I will assist. Because Stephen tries it once, he's unable to. And the Ancient One is pointing out to him, you know, it's only as heavy as You make it to be in your mind. And the Ancient One encourages Stephen, pull the rope and I will assist. So Stephen does that, and he is finally able to move it just a bit. And he's like, huh, perhaps he's right about something. So now that we got some of those lessons out of the way, speaking of lessons, there's one more thing I need to point out is that when the Ancient One is telling Stephen to surrender in the 2016 film, she portals him over to Mount Everest. And of course, Stephen struggles with that. But when he's trying to learn on his own and asks Wong for some other books, and Wong outright denies him access to said books, he takes things into his own hands. Since he now knows what the library looks like, well, he gets books from there, and then the Ancient One gets wind of it. And it is here where Stephen Strange learns that Wong literally tattletaled on him. Whereas in the 2007 animated film, when Mordo and Wong basically face a couple of Chinu demons that were advancing towards the Sanctum Sanctorum, they take the remaining sorcerers, and before they go, the Ancient One points out that it will take all of them to take down one. But Mordo, being arrogant, hot headed, decides to split the team into two. But as a result, despite defending the sanctum, they lose a lot of other sorcerers. And despite that, the Ancient One is pretty much angry at Mordo at this point. And he's telling him point blank, because of these losses, the title of Sorcerer Supreme was never going to be going to you. And Mordo is like, you would give the title to someone else? Who? I demand to know. And the Ancient One point blank lets him know, one who does not seek it. And Mordo is basically asking him at this point, so what is my role then? To train him. Now, the sparring between Mordo and Doctor Strange in the 2007 film is actually better than what you get from the MCU take. On top of that, since I now am trying to speed things up a little bit here, I'm going to cut towards the main character, that main villain himself, or at least the side villain. Okay, So now we get to the side villain in this case because Dormammu is the main focus. I want to point out here that I have no issues with the actor playing the character. What I do have issues with, again, writing and character development as well as accuracy. Mordo is the exact opposite of Stephen Strange in terms of not just skills, but also his pursuit of power. This is the one thing that they never addressed well with the 2016 MCU film. The only thing that they seem to have done correctly, briefly, is the post credit scene from the MCU film, where we see Mordo tracking down that one particular patient and extracting the magical essence that was being used. And that guy is now a cripple again. And he practically asks Mordo point blank, "Why are you doing this? I just realized something. Too many sorcerers." That one bit, they had potential of making him a villain. And they squandered it. They flippin' squandered it. And I'm not even gonna get into Multiverse of Madness at all. I'm just gonna touch on it. But frankly, this is why the 2007 film does it better. It knows the source material, it respects it, and they know what the flippin' hell they're doing. If I hadn't made clear already, again, the Ancient One lays out that Mordo is not to be trusted. He even tells Wong that, he needs to be closely watched. So when they get to the Sanctum Sanctorum, Doctor Strange learns a bit more about, what's going on. And he asks, as he's going with the group, "You guys had a back door this whole time?" And Wong points out to Strange, "You couldn't come this way the way you were, I mean, unlike the way you are now." So the Ancient One goes and explains that there are multiple dimensions, but they all have a connection point, if you will. And it is referred to as the Nexus. And Dormammu is practically a supernatural entity that has a voracious appetite. Now, I'll get to Dormammu in a bit, it's going to be covered later. But Mordo practically shows his true colors after Doctor Strange explains to Wong and the Ancient One about how he saw Dormammu. It is through the mind of a child. And then Mordo practically outright says there's only one way to stop Dormammu from passing through: kill the children. And the Ancient One says, "No, Mordo, that is never an option." And then Doctor Strange gives his suggestion, trying to wake him up. And as a result of that, the windows to the mind would close. And as Doctor Strange decides to go, Mordo simply says, "I will go with him in case a warrior is needed." Now, For those who are familiar with the character, obviously can delve a little bit further than I can. But the point is, he eventually turns on Strange because as Strange is trying to release the children, Mordo gets in and Dormammu practically asks him point blank, "Why are you here in my realm?" And he's asking him, "Why are you turning away from the Ancient One?" And Mordo practically outlines it to him. Because the Ancient One has turned away from me, and I come to offer my help. And Dormammu points out to Mordo, "I could trap you here like the children." And they kind of have a quick back and forth in terms of exchange on their dialogue. And Mordo's like, "That is true, you can keep me here, but then Doctor Strange would release me." And then by the time Strange is about to move on to the next child patient, he's too late. And he knows that Dormammu is making his move, and then finds out that Mordo is about to attack him. And Mordo thinks he got Strange, but he didn't. It was actually Wong. And the reason behind this is that prior to them leaving, the Ancient One looks at Wong and says, "I have something for you." While it's pretty obvious what that is, what wasn't said that viewers can actually grasp is what the Ancient One is telling Wong is, "I have a task for you in case something should happen to me." That's what is not said, but those who are smart enough to actually understand, story, dialogue, and everything else, how a story goes, is able to pick that up. Now, with that being said, with regards to the Mordo from 2007, I want to add a few more things before I go on to the brief summary on the MCU take. During the training sequence for Steven, Mordo asks him, "Have you ever held a blade in your life?" And Strange goes, "To save lives, yes, never to take them." And obviously, um, he manages to redirect Mordo's energy and use it right back at him. That really ticks him off, which causes Wong to intervene. And eventually, he takes over his training from there. Now, before I go any further on in terms of Stephen Strange and some other stuff, I want to get to now the 2016 take. The MCU version pretty much makes him a quote unquote anti hero in this case. And instead of being a villain, they make him kind of like another ally for Stephen Strange. There is something with regards to what the 2016 does, the 2007 does not. I'll get to that in the end. But as I said, they make him an ally, not an enemy. While admirable, I already pointed out the post-credit scene of the first film. They squandered it. There are some moments in the 2016 film that I like. Are there still parts that didn't do so well? Yes. But other than that, they know that he does have some skill. He is knowledgeable. I do not have any problems again with the actor. What I do have issues is writing. Totally different from what the actor is doing. Whatever his script he was given, fine. But the ones doing the writing are the ones I have beef with. Okay, so for those who are paying attention, if you guys were around the 80s and 90s, or a 90s kid like myself, you would have likely or possibly have seen the episode of Spider-Man the Animated Series in which we got to see Dormammu briefly and the team up between Doctor Strange and Spider-Man. Now, as much as I want to cover a particular Marvel film, I will not. What I will mention though is that what is clear towards the end of that episode for Spider Man, Wong asks Doctor Strange, "What's wrong?" He mentions to Wong that there is someone else that seems to have powers that rivals his. And then we get a brief glimpse of Madam Web. So, what's clear about this part right here is the fact that these two have not only different power sets, but the levels are obviously different. How different that is, others likely know it better than me. But I wanted to briefly show the visual representation from comic to animated series, and then we get the one from 2016. The one that is in the 2007 film, however, I think that's more with regards to how demonic he is, because obviously he lives in the dark dimension, and he obviously is a destroyer of worlds, kind of like Galactus. But why is it that I only showed those ones if I'm also talking about the 2007 film? I'll get to that in a bit. Basically, what I noticed is that when Doctor Strange is, you know, explaining to Mordo, Wong, and the Ancient One that he saw that face before, and, they're going about, like, how do you, prevent this guy from getting into the human world? Well, remember, you found out that Mordo already sided with Dormammu. There is one more creature that had yet to appear. And one thing I should mention, I'll probably mention it towards the end, but anyway, Dormammu does manage to get in because of what Mordo did. He eventually turns on Mordo after their fight, but prior to Dormammu coming in, the Ancient One mentions about a creature referred to as the Wing Mark. And there's only two sorcerers left, a female and a male. And what I found interesting about this third creature that is controlled by Dormammu is that he uses certain creatures to, I guess, in a way, herald his return, if you will. And the Ancient One points out that the wing mark would only appear at the coming of its master, in this case, Dormammu. So when this swarm of green, like demonic, you know, I don't know how else to put it, but it's kind of like if you think of, like a swarm of bugs, but with no face except for a mouth. That's roughly what the wing mark is. What I find interesting is that as it's making its way into the city, you can notice that some New Yorkers can see it and it kills some people. But the Ancient One is the only one powerful enough to destroy it. As a result, the Ancient One does destroy it. And before I go any further, I realized I made a slight miscalculation here. It wasn't just two sorcerers, there's actually three. Sorry, I misspoke. Not two, there was three. There was one sorcerer who is able to control um, or manipulate plants, in this case, trees. He gets killed. There's one sorcerer that's able to use a fire ability, kind of like in martial arts. And then we have the female sorceress who is able to cast barriers. All three of them perish at the wing mark. So by the time the Ancient One does destroy it, we see Mordo with the mark that indicates he's, joined forces with Dormammu. And so after Mordo kills the Ancient One, Wong does give the Eye of Agamotto to Steven. And after the fight between Mordo and Stephen Strange, Dormammu gets frustrated and he's like, "You have failed me for the last time. I have no more use for you," and just outright takes him out. Now, when he faces Steven, this one was actually, I don't know if I would say it's more of a battle of attrition than it is a assessment of skills. And Dormammu points out to Steven in the 2007 film, "You are a child face, fighting a god." And Steven does prove to have some impressive skill against Dormammu. He does hold his own a bit. Wong, wounded from the fight against Mordo, is observing the fight from a distance. And Dormammu temporarily gets a hold of the Eye of Agamotto that is around Steven. But when he is hit by a blast of magical energy by Dormammu, and Steven puts up a barrier, Wong actually dispels that barrier. And you would think that Steven would get hurt from it. But Wong is actually helping Steven and points out something, and Steven somehow manages to turn the situation around, but not in a way that Wong expects. Because he tells him, as they're fighting, that Dormammu is a being of pure magic. And then Steven, like I said, he turns the tables on Dormammu by stating, "You have the power of a god? Well, then give me it, all of it. And he practically absorbs and literally seals Dormammu in the eye. Now, in the 2016 one, I will point out that the way it looks like, I can sort of see that they're trying to give respect to the late Ditko, who did the comics, who did the style for Doctor Strange. And part of me was going, what am I looking at? What are they even trying to do? Now, we do get a little bit in terms of what this Dormammu can do, but it's brief. Yes, he's powerful and all of that, but the manner in terms of how he's attacking Strange, I'm like going, there's got to be more than this. And unfortunately, I don't think we actually got to see more of what this character can do, because most likely people know that some of these demonic entities in terms of Marvel, Dormammu isn't the only one that is around. You also have what's his name? Mephisto, as well as the Ghost Rider. Those are also on the supernatural end. And the thing is that while I do admire the fact that they are trying to respect um and also pay tribute to Ditko and his work, it just, I don't know, it was lacking. So in this case, I will say that if I'm going by skill alone, the edge goes to the 2007 film. If we're talking about visually, objectively, I would say that 2007 has a bit of an edge. But in terms of the appearance of what is close to the comic, this case, I would say I would give that to the 2016 film. Some of you are probably going, wait, what? He's finally given the MCU film a point? There are a few things that the MCU does that the 2007 animated film doesn't. Now, once I get that part out of the way, then I'm going to go over both films as a whole. But with that being said, in comparison to accuracy here for Dormammu, skill set, the 2007 film gets a point. In terms of accuracy, arguably, objectively, I will give that to the MCU film. Subjectively, I would also give it to the film. But I will also say kudos to the 2007 for trying to at least stay on point with the actual origins. Okay, so since I updated the scorecard here, it is pretty clear that I am leaning in terms of this analysis more with the 2007 animated film versus the MCU film of the same title. However, I will state that there are some enjoyable parts of the MCU film that is different, that is also covered pretty decently compared to that of the 2007 animated film. So, what does the MCU have that the animated film does not have? Well, visually, it is more in line with the late Ditko, who actually, penned the character. They respected that part, at least, visually speaking. Now, in terms of how Dormammu is represented, while I do applaud their attempt, if I had to say which one had it more on the demon side, it's obviously the 2007 one. But if we're going by visual itself, I can sort of see what they were trying to do with the MCU. Would I say they succeeded? I think so. Now, if we're going strictly by story, that one goes to the 2007 film. Are there issues with the 2016 Doctor Strange? Yes, there is. Have I already stated it? Yeah, I have. But overall, if I'm going to be giving this a quick grade, objectively, the 2007 film, I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10. As for subjectively, I'm knocking it down 1 point to 8 out of 10. 2016, objectively, a 7, subjectively, an 8. There are some parts that I like about it, some parts could have been done better. Overall, I will say that Madsen as the side villain in this case was all right. The actor's not the issue. The writing, I will always state it, is the issue. But obviously, with Multiverse of Madness, thank heavens I never watched it. I already knew everything was going downhill post Endgame. But there are plenty of red flags that pointed the direction that it was going downhill. Winter Soldier being one, Thor being another. Then, of course, we got the issue with Doctor Strange and the girl boss nonsense. But it really took a dive with Captain Identity Politics. And we know how that went. But yeah, with that being said, I will be going over a particular manga this Friday with another YouTuber for my Otaku Center section of my channel. I will be eventually doing that at some point. And this is the one I'm going to be going over. Magic Knight Rayearth actually started in the mid to early 90s. I want to be clear, even though I'm going over all three, it is actually the first two that were released within the same year, whereas the final one for the first set was released a year later. But other than that, I will eventually also be going over the DC Universe. If it wasn't clear before, I said it already in one of my other videos. I'm going to be going over Wonder Woman, another comparison video. But I'm not going to be going as clip heavy like I did with this. With that being said, this has been Skyhound, also known as Geek Detective Pierce. Hope you guys enjoyed this. Hit the like and subscribe button for more. Stay safe, stay sane, and as always, stay humble. Peace.